Spectrovision Radio.
Welcome back to Cosmosis. I'm your host, Kelly Chase. Last month, I had the opportunity to attend a workshop at the University of Exeter in England on the topic of process philosophy, plasma cosmology, and transpersonal psychology. This workshop, sponsored by the Center for Process Studies, the University of Exeter, the University of Hawaii, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, brought together a group of scientists, philosophers, and researchers from very different backgrounds to spend several days in conversation. We were there to wrestle with the implications of bleeding-edge science that suggests something extraordinary, that plasma, the fourth state of matter, might be able to serve as a substrate for non-biological intelligence. This idea is perhaps best articulated by Robert Temple in his book, A New Science of Heaven. In it, he argues that the universe is not primarily made of matter as we think of it, solids, liquids, and gases, but of plasma, which makes up over 99% of the observable cosmos. Temple suggests that plasma may not just be an inert substance, but a medium capable of complex organization, memory, and perhaps even consciousness. If that's true, then we may be embedded in a vast plasma-based ecology, one that we have only just begun to glimpse. The significance of that idea is staggering. It means that intelligence might not be rare, accidental, or confined to biology at all. It could be fundamental to the fabric of the universe itself. I was so inspired by my fellow attendees, who included Robert Temple himself, along with Jeffrey Kripal, Bernard Carr, Massimo Teodorani, Nick Cook, and many others. These were conversations that I know I'll be turning over in my mind for years to come. If you'd like to learn more about the workshop itself, I've attached the full program in the episode notes. And it looks like the papers we presented are being compiled into a book, which I'll share with you as soon as it becomes available. I also hope that you'll be hearing from some of the other participants on this podcast in the next few months ahead, so stay tuned for that. The paper I presented at Exeter is the one you'll hear in today's episode. It's called Unfurling the Myth, Narrative as Interface Between the Psyche and the Field. It represents some of the deeper work and thinking I've been doing as a part of a book that I am very slowly writing. This paper tries to get at something I've been circling for a long time, that the UFO isn't simply an object or anomaly, but a relational event that uses the structure of story itself to remake our realities. I hope you enjoy it. Introduction. The ancient phenomenon that we currently refer to as the UFO has always been more than just an object in the sky. From its earliest appearances in the modern cultural imagination, it has functioned less as a discrete object and more like a rupture in reality itself. Though modern framing has largely succeeded in presenting this phenomenon in terms of advanced technology, for those who have encountered the UFO, it presents not just as an aerial anomaly, but as an ontological one. It is an incursion that calls the very foundations of knowledge into question. The significance of the UFO lies in our inability to explain it. It flickers on the edges of our collective awareness, appearing, disappearing, and reconfiguring itself in form and meaning across time, culture, and consciousness. It's not just one thing, but many. It is craft, symbol, vision, archetype, artifact, and revelation all in one. But even these categories are imprecise and slippery. Any attempt to stabilize the meaning and substance of the UFO ultimately collapses under the weight of its infernal ambiguity. The persistence of this one quality, even as every other aspect of the phenomenon remains in constant flux, suggests that the ambiguity itself is the phenomenon. All else is window dressing. This paper proposes that the UFO phenomenon functions not merely as an anomalous object or event, but as a catalyst that activates the deep structures of narrative cognition to initiate transformation, first at the personal and then at the cultural level. The utter violation of its mere existence is so profound that it doesn't just disturb our categories of understanding, it prompts the generation of new ones. The UFO doesn't simply manifest in our reality, it requires us to co-create a new reality in response. This process of reality co-creation unfolds through narrative. In this sense, the stories we tell ourselves about the UFO are not merely retrospective framings of remembered events. They are the very mechanisms by which the psyche makes meaning and brings new worlds into being. I argue that narrative is not simply a response to reality, but an interface between the psyche and the field, a generative structure through which the raw ambiguity of the anomalous is shaped into meaning. When something radically disruptive emerges, something that breaks the frame, it doesn't just challenge our understanding, it initiates myth, setting the narrative engine in motion. In this view, myth is neither primitive science nor unchecked imaginative impulse. It is the technology of transformation. By refusing to resolve, by refusing to land, the UFO becomes the perfect mythic initiator. The phenomenon drags us, often unwillingly, into the liminal space beyond interpretations, which the psyche must stretch itself to accommodate. The phenomenon invites not belief, but storying. And in that act of creation, something shifts, not only in the individual who experiences it, but in the field itself. Rethinking the UFO. Our limitations in decoding the UFO may lie in part in the cultural scaffolding we have erected around the phenomenon. While a growing number of hypotheses about the origins of UFO encounters have proliferated over the past several decades, extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, extratempestrial, interdimensional, etc., when broken down to their component parts, they each rely on the same basic premise. They all boil down to the idea that something more or less like us is coming here in craft that function more or less like our own for reasons that are ultimately very human. However, the lived reality of confronting the UFO phenomenon, as reported by countless contact experiencers, resists that framing. In the free experiencer research study, which surveyed over 3,200 individuals reporting contact with non-human intelligence, the most commonly encountered entities were not biological beings in spacecraft. Instead, 55% of participants described encounters with energy beings, and 47% reported spirit or ghost-like forms. Further, these encounters often take place in altered states of consciousness or out-of-body experiences, and they can feature dreamlike, symbolic, and non-linear sequences of events. Rather than suggesting a purely technological visitation from an advanced civilization that is still ultimately very much like our own, the data mined from experiencer narratives tends to imply that the phenomenon is far more complex than our current models allow. In his book, A New Science of Heaven, Robert Temple presents an hypothesis that may provide a way forward. He proposes that plasma, the fourth state of matter, may be a viable substrate of complex intelligence. Considering the fact that over 99% of the observable universe is comprised of plasma, Temple's work suggests that we may be embedded within a vast, sentient, plasma-based ecology, a hidden world that coexists alongside us, but which operates according to principles that we have only just begun to understand. The implications of this are significant. If we are surrounded by plasma-based intelligence, then we are likely not dealing with human-like visitors at all, but rather with a form of consciousness fundamentally unlike our own, discontinuous with our biology, our communication systems, and even our conception of selfhood. Given these radical differences, it may be that the reason that such intelligences don't communicate with us in straightforward, literal ways is because they can't. The biological and cognitive incommensurability between species could very well make traditional forms of communication impossible. In their seminal 2003 paper, Incommensurability, Orthodoxy, and the Physics of High Strangeness, a 6-layer model for anomalous phenomena, Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis argue that non-human intelligences may be communicating by embedding their messages in symbolic events and narrative structures that speak directly to the unconscious mind. Vallée and Davis argue that the UFO phenomenon functions as an iconic system, one that operates through resemblance and metaphor rather than arbitrary symbols. In semiotic terms, an icon is a sign that resembles its referent, as opposed to a symbol which is arbitrarily assigned. However, they note that the recognition of resemblance depends on the observer. That is, icons work only if the perceiving intelligence shares enough context to see the connection. And when that context is lacking, as it almost certainly would be between radically different intelligences, then narrative, myth, and archetype become essential tools. In this view, the UFO encounter becomes not a discrete event, but a transmission. It is a story that is delivered in the only language that can be universally understood, which is the structure of experience itself. It bypasses the intellect to activate something older, deeper, and more foundational than human knowing. If this is true, then our attempts to reduce the UFO to technology and origin, where are they from, how did they get here, what do they want, may be missing the point entirely. The UFO may not be here to explain anything. It may be here to initiate us into a new mode of perceiving reality through the cultivation of new myths. Catalyzing the myth. The mythic doesn't appear unbidden or fully formed. It emerges out of tension, through the friction between what we know and what we cannot yet name. And few things are calibrated to generate that friction in the human psyche as precisely and potently as the UFO. In his paper, The Psychology of Curiosity, economist and psychologist George Loewenstein proposed that curiosity arises not from a general thirst for knowledge, but from the recognition of a specific gap in one's understanding. He identified 4 primary ways of involuntarily inducing curiosity in the human mind. 1. The posing of a question or presentation of a puzzle. 2. Exposure to a sequence of events with an anticipated but unknown resolution. 3. The violation of expectations that triggers a search for an explanation. And 4. Knowledge that someone else possesses information that we do not. While every encounter with the UFO manifests itself differently, at the heart of most experiences, we almost universally find all, or nearly all, of Loewenstein's triggers for involuntary curiosity. The UFO defies our expectations of the real in ways that aren't just surprising, but ontologically destabilizing. These events are often dreamlike, unfolding in ways that are nonlinear, symbolic, and more often than not, self-undermining. They leave the witness with the uncanny sense that something of significance has been set into motion, though the purpose is rarely made clear. And compounding that ambiguity is the pervasive secrecy that seemingly surrounds the phenomenon, which hints that others may hold the key to understanding these indecipherable events. It's hard to deny the fact that the UFO seems perfectly engineered to evoke our curiosity, even against our will. But the curiosity it inspires isn't idle. It is often experienced as visceral, urgent, and even distressing. In his book, The Science of Storytelling, Why Stories Make Us Human and How to Tell Them Better, Will Storr writes of Loewenstein's curiosity triggers, quote, "Brain scans reveal that curiosity begins as a little kick in the brain's reward system. We crave to know the answer or what happens next in the story in the way we might crave drugs or sex or chocolate. This pleasantly unpleasant state that causes us to squirm with tantalized discomfort at the delicious promise of an answer is undeniably powerful. During one experiment, psychologists noted archly that their participants' compulsion to know the answer was so great that they were willing to pay for the information, even though curiosity could have been sated for free after the session." End quote. But for people whose curiosity has been piqued not in a lab, but by the incursion of the impossible into their reality, resolving this tension is much more difficult. Loewenstein observed that curiosity is shaped much like a bell curve. It's at its lowest when we know little to nothing, and again when we think we know everything. Curiosity is at its peak in the space in between, where we think we might know, but we aren't quite sure. It is in that zone that the UFO phenomenon lives. It gives the observer just enough to suggest that there is something real to be uncovered, but not enough to allow for belief to stabilize. The result is a kind of cognitive stasis that feels anything but static. It churns. And that churning is generative. When a person is faced with an experience that doesn't conform to their notions of what is possible, it creates a tear that can only be stitched back together with narrative. The natural and inevitable response to the introduction of an unanswerable question is the generation of new stories, ideas, and frameworks. Awakening the hero. To be caught in a state of unresolved narrative tension so powerful that it distorts cognition, emotion, and behavior is to be in the opening act of an initiatory process. Within the structure of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, a narrative template found in mythic storytelling across cultures, this is known as the call to adventure. It is the moment when the hero's ordinary world is punctured by something that suggests both that the world is not what they thought it was, and, crucially, that they have an important role to play in what is to unfold. It's the letter arriving from Hogwarts. It's Gandalf giving you the ring. The call to adventure doesn't just spark the transformational process that will follow, it places the hero at the center of it. In this moment, the NPC becomes the main character. The story is no longer just something that is happening to them. It's not just an anomalous event to interpret. It becomes an emergent unfolding, one that they are responsible for. The incursion of the impossible doesn't just challenge their worldview, it hands them the narrative thread and asks, what are you going to do about it? The process of being suddenly thrust into the center of a story that seems to carry cosmic weight can be exhilarating, destabilizing, and flattering. It can feel like an initiation into a deeper layer of reality, one that is hidden from most and only revealed to a chosen few. In the book, Spiritual Emergency When Personal Transformation Becomes a Crisis, authors Stanislav and Christina Groff et al. Describe how the scaffolding of meaning that has been erected around experiences of close encounters with UFOs can change a person's self-conception. Quote, the alien visitors are usually seen as representatives of civilizations that are incomparably more advanced than ours, not only technologically, but intellectually, morally, and spiritually. Such contact often has very powerful mystical undertones and is associated with insights of cosmic relevance. It's easy for the recipients of such special attention to interpret this as an indication of their own uniqueness. They might feel that they have attracted the interest of superior beings from an advanced civilization because they themselves are in some way exceptional and particularly suited for a special purpose. In Jungian terminology, such a situation in which the individual claims the luster of the archetypal world for his or her own person is referred to as ego inflation. End quote. The call to adventure issued by the UFO can mark a major turning point for the witness. If integrated well, it can help to restore a sense of agency in people who may have long felt powerless, disconnected, or invisible. In a world where many people increasingly feel like background characters in someone else's story, the encounter can offer the intoxicating possibility that the individual matters, that their choices have cosmic weight, and that their life has meaning beyond the mundane. There is, of course, danger here. This brand of ego inflation can easily spiral into grandiosity, delusion, or paranoia. Without proper grounded integration, the new hero may mistake symbolic truth for literal destiny. They may begin to see themselves not as a participant in a larger mystery, but as the very axis upon which it turns. Still, the reactivation of agency is not something to be dismissed as only dangerous. It can also serve a very useful purpose. In a time when people are increasingly alienated from meaning, when our myths have frayed and our institutions inspire more cynicism than trust, this psychological shift, however chaotic, can be a lifeline. It reconfigures the story not just around the experiencer, but through them. New ideas need a champion, one that is sufficiently catalyzed to push through the stigma and ridicule that often befall those who question consensus reality. This awakening of agency is necessary in the UFO witness in order for the transmission to trigger transformation, not just in the individual, but in the greater culture. Remaking the world. If we assume that the UFO encounter functions as a kind of transmission, one designed to inject new ideas into the culture through the witness, then the question becomes, what is the purpose of this intervention? Trying to decipher the motivations of a non-human intelligence, especially one that may be plasma-based, interdimensional, or emergent from a larger field of consciousness, presents considerable challenges. How can we begin to understand something that is so different from ourselves? The very concept of goals or motivation might not even apply. In fact, it's likely that they don't, at least not in the human sense. So any conclusions that we draw about these intelligences must be offered with a heavy dose of intellectual humility and an awareness of what we can know and what we cannot. Still, if we take a teleological approach, if we accept, at least for the sake of argument, that a thing is, in some essential way, what it does, we can find a tentative way forward. Clear patterns emerge in the data concerning how the beliefs and attitudes of UFO witnesses change in the wake of their experiences. And these patterns seem to indicate that, whatever this intelligence may be, it is engaged in a long game type of intervention aimed not at domination, but at transformation. The Free Experiencer research study asked individuals who reported contact with non-human intelligences about how those experiences had affected their lives. The results were striking. 80% or more of participants reported a positive shift in attitude or belief about the following topics: their understanding of themselves, their understanding of what life is all about, their interest in self-understanding, concern with the welfare of the planet, a desire to achieve a higher consciousness, concerns with spiritual matters, insight into the problems of others, appreciation of nature, a personal sense of purpose in life, finally, a sense of the sacred aspect of life. It is clear that these effects are not small or incidental. They represent significant and often lasting shifts in the worldview of the UFO witness that skews heavily in the direction of self-reflection, spiritual growth, ecological awareness, and a profound reenchantment of life. And interestingly, these patterns are consistent despite the vast differences between individual encounters and seemingly regardless of whether the person classifies the nature of the initial encounter as positive, negative, or somewhere in between. However that catalyzing event manifests, the long-term impact on how the experiencer perceives the world post-experience still converges around these similar themes. If we take these patterns seriously, and if we treat the effect as the message, then certain contingent assumptions about the intelligence behind these encounters become plausible. The first is that this is about cultural evolution, not conquest. The impact of these messages doesn't point to an agenda of obedience, control, or resource extraction. It's centered instead on awakening, healing, and the expansion of consciousness. What is being seeded into culture is not fear, but mythic potential. Second, it's about life, connection, and planetary stewardship. The repeated emphasis on environmental responsibility, compassion, and the sacredness of life implies a purpose that is both life-affirming and ethically engaged. There is urgency in the message, but not coercion. Earth is framed not as a battlefield, but as a crucible, an important node in a much larger unfolding. Third, it emphasizes the importance of personal self-mythology. These encounters disrupt the ordinary world and initiate the witness into a new way of being, one that often includes a mission, a transformation, and a broader sense of identity. They are not issuing decrees, they are planting seeds. Finally, it suggests that these intelligences are not entirely other. The experiences often evoke a feeling of oneness, of deep interconnection, and of awakening to something already within. This suggests that the boundary between self and other, between human and non-human, may be less rigid than we assume. The beings may not be visitors in the traditional sense, but emergent properties of the same field of consciousness that gives rise to us. Taken together, these patterns suggest that we are not dealing with a hostile force, or even an entirely non-human one. but with something far more mysterious and generative. In this light, the anomalous encounter is not just a curiosity, it is a cultural intervention. It initiates myth not as entertainment, but as an evolutionary function. And through the experiencer, it remakes the world. Until next time.